Антикорупційна інфраструктура України стримує наступ корупції, а суспільство і міжнародні партнери підтримують їх у цій боротьбі. На початку березня Кабінет міністрів України затвердив Державну антикорупційну програму на 2023-2025 роки як необхідний крок для проведення реформ і забезпечення демократичних змін.
Сьогодні ж Кабмін на своєму засіданні, яке фактично поєдналося з засіданням Конгресу, затвердив Державну антикорупційну програму. Це системні кроки, які дають державі більше прозорості, а суспільству більше можливостей для взаємодії з державою.
Державна антикорупційна програма – це покрокова інструкція боротьби з корупцією, яка допоможе вирішити 73 проблеми у 15 сферах суспільного життя. Кожен українець зможе контролювати виконання Державної антикорупційної програми через спеціальну платформу, створену Національним агентством з питань запобігання корупції. Якісна державна політика – найкоротший шлях до подолання корупції.
So this was a very short presentation, a video presentation of the State Anti-Corruption Program. I was just now watching it and I thought that when I announced about the air raid alarm restrictions, I thought that this event itself, this announcement, tells us that we are living within the history. The history is passing by. Sometimes it is passing by as a sharp knife, and sometimes, as today, we are feeling that we have this hopeful page of the history textbook where we are now living in together with you. So, the State Anti-Corruption Program, the National Agency on Prevention of Corruption, together with the partners, together with an anti-corruption initiative of the European Union, together with the state institutions of Ukraine, together with the non-public organizations and the experts, have prepared the State Anti-Corruption Program to implement the State Anti-Corruption Strategy, and we will be speaking about that today. That is a colossal, a huge piece of work and an investment of lots of the people. That is why we will welcome those people here today, and the introduction speeches will be told by the people who have gathered now on the stage. So we'll have Ruslan Stefanchuk, the head of the Parliament, Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. We have Marty Masikas, the head of the Representative Office of the European Union in Ukraine, Rostislav Shurma, Deputy Head of the Presidential Office of Ukraine, Alexander Korniyenko, First Deputy of the Head of the Parliament, Oleg Nemchino, the Minister of the Cabinet of Ministers, Vera Mikhailenko, the Head of the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court, and Alexander Novikov, the Head of the National Agency on Corruption Prevention. So, dear friends, we are very short of time for the introduction speeches, so I would really ask you for your speeches not to be longer than 5 minutes each. So, let us start. I don't know whether we have Ruslan Stefanchuk online with us. Yes, he is here. Okay. If he is here, Ruslan, we welcome you here, so please, your 4 minutes. Let us make only 4 minutes for each of you. I just calculated that if I just divide it by 7, it will be 4 minutes for each. So, hello. Dear Alexander Sergeyevich, Alexander Fedorovich, Rostislav, Alexander, Vera, Your Excellency, dear participants of the conference, the issue of the prevention of corruption does not lose its relevance even during the war times, and it's pleasant for me to mention that Ukraine is showing the substantial progress in that, in spite of all of the resources of the state and the society are allocated for the protection from the unprovoked military aggression of Russian Federation. And you know that the index of corruption perception in Ukraine during 2022 has improved for 1 point, and the Greco state group has mentioned the progress of Ukraine in the recommendations in the fight against corruption. And the most important thing, that we have the political will to fight corruption, and you can see it at the latest examples which are taking place in Ukraine. Besides that, it is defined in the adoption of the certain decisions. As you know, the parliament has adopted the anti anti-corruption strategy on the 20th of June last year, and the tasks of this strategy would be impossible without the implementation of the state anti-corruption program, which would be the roadmap of this reform in the sphere. The legislative level has introduced the whole line of mechanisms in coordination and implementation of the state anti-corruption program and strategy, the monitoring and assessment of their implementation, the creation of the information system of monitoring the implementation of the state anti-corruption policy. Thanks to that, we have substantial expectations that the practical implementation foreseen by the state anti-corruption program will give the opportunity to cleanse the state staff from the corrupt officials and to get rid of the corrupt schemes in the key spheres of the policy, to decrease the number of corrupt factors in the society. And also, we need to remember that the efficient investigations are one of the requirements on the way of Ukraine to the European Union. I'm sure that consolidating our efforts, we will be able to accomplish this task and to have the A grade in that. It seems to me it's high time to transfer from the discussions to the implementation, to the realization of anti-corruption measures. So I thank you, dear colleagues. I don't want to waste your time. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to you, the heroes. Ruslan Stefanchuk, the head of Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, we thank you for being so short. And to have this gender balance, I am giving the floor to Vera Mikhailenko, the head of the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court. Vera, please, the floor is yours. You need to turn on the mic, please. Good day. Well, in fact, I'm happy to be here with you today at this event, which is devoted to the state anti-corruption program, in spite of the fact that the institution which I represent, we do not consider ourselves to be elements of anti-corruption infrastructure, but taking into consideration these connections with other authorities which are directly implementing the fight against corruption, it is obvious that we are also involved in this process. So as for directly the state anti-corruption program, as for me, this is a certain navigator which leads the state into the legal field, which gets rid of all of the obstacles. Well, sorry for the tautology, which are on the way to achieve the main objective, the rule of law principle, the human rights, and to use in Ukraine all the democratic values, all the democratic standards which have already been implemented before us by European Commonwealth and the world community. And also it is so pleasant for me, I would say, that the issues of the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court are also foreseen in this program. I do hope to have support of the certain authorities in the promotion and practical implementation of the norms which are already in the program, and I would like to wish all of us success in the practical implementation of this program for all of the actors who are involved in this process. Thank you. Thank you, Vera. That was Vera Mikhailenko, the head of the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court. So please, I give the floor now to Mati Maasikas, the head of the Representation Office of the European Union in Ukraine. Hello, good morning. Does it work now? Yes, it does. So I'm so happy to welcome all of you at this really important event.
Of the aggressor state delivered a notorious speech a couple of days before the invasion. He got one thing right. He listed named Ukrainian anti-corruption institutions and the judicial reform in Ukraine in fair detail. And that's exactly what the Kremlin is fearing. A democratic, modern Ukraine which checks and balances and independent rule of law institutions in place. Judging from today's topic, the list of speakers and the impressive presence of the representatives of anti-corruption institutions, it is clear that the aggressor state has completely failed. Ukraine is winning its fight for freedom and democracy on the battlefield, and by ensuring its institutional and administrative strength through reforms. Very pleased to be here today with you with the ambitious agenda on an issue that is of high relevance for Ukraine's future and Ukraine's determined path towards the European Union membership. Ukraine has come a long way when addressing corruption, from setting up independent anti-corruption institutions after the Revolution of Dignity to closing the space for corruption, to advancing on judicial reform and digitalization. And even now, during wartime, Ukraine continues progressing with its anti-corruption reforms. Not only are all the institutions fully operational, but we also see a constant strive for reforms across all sectors. And the results of these reforms are acknowledged. Ukraine is clearly on a EU membership path. International financial institutions provide macro-financial assistance. Ukraine continues to steadily progress on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, and just last week the Council of Europe's group of states against corruption, known as GRECO, praised the good progress made. And the adoption of the anti-corruption strategy last year and the state anti-corruption program in March are another clear proof that also at the strategic policy level Ukraine is delivering and advancing. I very much appreciate the leadership of NAZK in developing the program in a very inclusive process with all relevant stakeholders. The adopted program is a credible program, a very detailed program. A program that can set the standards even for other countries, including EU and OECD countries. Could it have been even more ambitious? Probably yes. Could it have been adopted faster? Probably yes. But what eventually will matter is how the program now is implemented and put into practice, rigorously and collectively. Its implementation will further demonstrate the government's commitment to strengthening the anti-corruption institutions, public administration, and the rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marty Marsikas, the head of the Representative Office of the European Union in Ukraine. Thank you. I give the floor to Alexander Novikov, the head of the National Agency on the Prevention of Corruption. Should I sum it up? Should I have my speech now? Well, it is written that those are just introduction speeches. So I think that this should be just introduction and greeting. Okay, dear colleagues, my greeting words will be devoted to the gratitude to all of the presentees for the investment into the adoption of the state anti-corruption strategy, the gratitude to the Parliament, gratitude to the Verkhovna Rada for the adoption of the program itself on the implementation of anti-corruption strategy, the gratitude words to Mr. Ambassador and Anti-Corruption Initiative of the EU, Mr. Allen and Irina, who is the deputy, the representatives of the Central Executive Branch authorities, the head of Anti-Monopoly Committee, the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court, and all of other authorities which were involved into the development of the strategy and the state anti-corruption program. In our agency, we believe that the state policy should be as inclusive as possible, so we are grateful to all of the international organizations, public organizations, and NGOs, including the representatives of our council. I thank Katerina and the head of the Council of the National Agency on Prevention of Corruption and all of the other organizations and the journalists, because lots of information was given how we could define all the problematic issues. We got them from the journalist investigations. We believe in our agency that any state policy should be based upon the data. And of course, we will speak about that during the presentation of the research of the level of corruption, which were defined by the sociological research. In the spheres where we concentrate the measures of anti-corruption policy, that is the inclusive character and the data-based approach is what in the basis and the foundation of anti-corruption policy, and the implementation of the anti-corruption policy should provide the work of the legislative branch and executive executive branch, and for them to be based just upon the data and the request from the citizens of Ukraine. As of now, we've got cultural, civilizational shifts in the moods of Ukrainians. 61% of Ukrainians are not ready to get to corrupt practices under any circumstances. 84% of the Ukrainians, according to the latest researchers, are ready to protest any corruption. So, dear colleagues, we still need to satisfy this request of the citizens for justice, and the high-quality implementation of the program will achieve that. Now I give the floor to the Minister of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, Oleg Nemchinov. Thank you. I don't want, well, as Marty Marsikas, I don't want to quote the presidents of neighboring countries. I will quote the President Zelensky when he assessed the adoption of a program which was done together with the Congress of the local and regional authorities. It was the hard way and it was a nice way. But for more than a year of the active warfare and combat time, we had several cases connected with anti-corruption. One of them is the election of the head of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and now we have the second direction electing the head of ARMA, which is also the component of the anti-corruption architecture in Ukraine. So I think that everybody is sure that the Secretariat of the Cabinet of Ministers and the Cabinet of Ministers itself as the executive branch authority are doing everything possible not to have any doubts or questions in the procedures, in the documents registration, and that the anti-corruption program has been discussed for such a long time, had two governmental committees, there were remarks for more than a dozen of executive branch authorities. It witnesses what is the level now of the structural departments of the Secretariat, of the central executive branch authorities, what's the level of their attitude towards this document, and about the cases which we had together with the Parliament and which are awaiting for us ahead of us. That is the memorandum with the International Monetary Fund, which witnesses that for the first in the history of the Ministry of Interior, the country in the state of war gets a huge program. So one of the proper factors is the compulsory declaration. I would like to achieve this milestone and not to come back to that shameful practice which we had during the previous years, when every public person or state official who declares his or her property and anything he or she has, to make this process torturous, to make it full of mistakes and protocols when you just write one figure improperly. We are creating the digital state, so I hope that the MPs will adopt the digital character of declaration. They will take into account that the state doesn't have the right to claim from the citizen, whoever the citizen is, the data which the state doesn't own. And this data will be automatically approved and confirmed from the archive. And we will just deal with our usual things. We will declare the gifts and so on. Glory to Ukraine. Thank you. Glory to the heroes.
And now Ruslan Savachuk, the head of Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, will have a floor. No, I'm sorry, Alexander Korniyenko, first deputy of the head of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Yes, after Oleg, it's very difficult to add anything more practical, but I would say a more general theme. This is definitely a very important and remarkable event to adoption of the program, an anti-corruption program. So we know that it was a very important part of our work in the process of preparation to get the candidacy of the EU. And we are still at the very beginning of this path. But I'd like to talk about the executives of this program. State anti-corruption program this is not only about the anti-corruption infrastructure, about bodies which should cooperate with each other. We all understand that they have to cooperate, but the state anti-corruption program tells us that the whole country is the infrastructure for anti-corruption work. This is an anti-monopoly committee which also has to be a bit reformatted. This is also our issues related to corporate governance, because here we have to adopt new legislation according to the requirements of the OECD, and also household level corruption. This is also a problem which should be dealt with, and we have to work with it. Yes, there are optimistic numbers which Alexander has raised already. We will hear a lot of optimistic numbers today on attitude of Ukrainians to the corruption. They will tolerate corruption less with time. This is a good trend, but we have to be clear that corruption could be a very serious threat to the security of our country. So this is our common responsibility of the democracy of the republic. And the parliament will play its role in this regard. Thank you very much, Oleg, for recalling that memorandum we've already seen. And we understand that there are a lot of steps in this document, a lot of documents, a lot of laws have to be adopted during this year and further. And we will have to introduce a lot of amendments into different pieces of legislation in order to bring our legislation in line with the international practices. Of course, we have to restore the full infrastructure, anti-corruption infrastructure. We already remember the case when the declaring system was abolished in one night, and we have returned it in 3 days. We've managed that. I think that this situation we have today, that this system doesn't work, should be abolished too, and we have returned to declaring income, and this is our responsibility before those who fight for our independence on the East. And now, yes, we also see that now our country has some positive moments which now become the best practice in the world, and I hope that digitalization will help us to build all the processes in the most efficient way, and this society will be able to get all the important information, especially taking into account the wartime which we have as of now. So congratulations to us all, but we will have a lot of work ahead, and let's implement our anti-corruption program and anti-corruption strategy together. Thank you very much, Alexander Korniyenko, First Deputy Head of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. We had many discussions with Mr. Korniyenko on air, and we see how many work was done. And now I would like to give a floor to Deputy Head of the Office of the President, Mr. Shurma. Rostislav, please, over to you, Rostislav. Good morning, dear colleagues. I'd like to look at another aspect of anti-corruption work. For the last half year, I had a lot of meetings with many investors, international partners, and national colleagues. And one issue raised almost at every meeting, it was actually an issue: what is the progress in anti-corruption activities? Not all other issues, but this specific issue. What is the progress of the anti-corruption activities? And this means that until the business sees the transparency and work in this regard, we shouldn't wait for investments. Since we should have almost 80% of private investments to make recovery efficient, we have to work efficiently on combating the corruption, otherwise we won't have the recovery of our country as we expect. In order to look at this from the practical angle, we should look into 3 primary zones which generate the corruption. First of all, this is the licensing system, and also this is the tax system. These 2 sectors take almost 70% of all corruption, corrupt actions, which actually generate the corruption, and they generate actions which have consequences to all the economy. So what should we do? We should eliminate the primary reasons, but with which tools? First of all, with digitalization, and to bring it to responsibility. I will bring one example here. We just have many discussions with international partners on, which is based on this principle I have mentioned, to eliminate the possible reasons for the corruptions, and it entails a lot of actions which are already being in the process of implementation. Another example, simplification and digitalization. These are initiatives which have been already launched in a land sphere and in spatial planning and construction activities in order to minimize contacts with officials and civil servants. So that will help to minimize the corrupt actions. I hope we will be able to bring all these steps to the successful and efficient end, and it will help us to eliminate the corruption. Thank you very much for your welcoming words, and thank you for your time and for these important things you've said. We have many people today, and we have many people sitting here near to me. It gives me optimism because it means that you all want to be involved into this important activity. Thank you very much for helping with dealing with corruption issues. Now I'd like to start talking about this sociological survey, which was already mentioned by Alexander Novikov. It relates to the issues of understanding, perception, and prevalence of corruption in Ukraine. It was conducted with the support of the EU in December of the year 2022. The respondents who were surveyed are the population and the representatives of business organizations. These data is representative for the territories of Ukraine, where for the territories which are controlled by Ukraine, and it is not relevant for uncontrolled territories of Ukraine. I would like to introduce our speakers, Mr. Harchenko, analytic from National Anti-Corruption Agency, Mr. Dmytro Savchuk from InfoSapiens organization, and Deputy Head of National Agency of Preventing Corruption. So we will go straight to this slide number 1, which relates to the place of corruption among the most serious problems for Ukraine. How people do perceive it. You see that the Russia's armed aggression is 90%, more than 90%. It is a concern of the population. But at the third place, you already see the corruption. And this is actually an answer. Is it time to reform legislation and to conduct reforms regarding the combating of corruption issues? And the second slide shows us how did the business and population assess the change in the level of corruption in Ukraine. And this is something I'd like to ask Mr. Harchenko to comment. Good morning. As you see, we see quite a change comparing to the previous year. From among the population, the portion of those who are saying that the level of corruption has decreased increased to 10 points, up to 10 points. But it is important to mention that mostly the population provides more negative responses, and 29% of them claim that corruption increased. But the situation looks different if we are talking about the business. Comparing the previous years, the situation is different. Almost 36% of business representatives claim that the corruption level decreased, but 16% claim that it increased. This assessment shouldn't lead us to incorrect conclusions. At the same time, we see that unfortunately a perception of likelihood of the corruption is still high. The next slide demonstrates who do Ukrainians identify as responsible for overcoming corruption in the country. This would be the most interesting piece of the statistics. So first three points are the President of Ukraine and the Office of the President of Ukraine. Also, from among top three, we see National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine and also Verkhovna Rada Ukraine. It is important to mention that from among the first top five, we have National Agency of Corruption Prevention and also the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. But we don't see here the respective court. And every fifth person claims that the government and the ministries are responsible, and that puts additional social responsibility on these institutions, especially in the context of the implementation of anti-corruption program and respective policy. And the next slide, the most corrupt areas. As far as I understand, 11 areas were covered. Yes, 11 areas were covered, and as we see from this slide, in 2022, comparing to 2021, the level of corruption decreased in most areas, but most of all it is related to the decrease of the frequency of the contacts with civil servants and officials. From among leaders are law enforcement agencies. Every third person has claimed that in this sphere there is a corruption. Also, communal services, gas supply, water supply, 29% here, and this indicator almost hasn't changed comparing to the previous year. And in top three, we also see service centers of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And I'd like to note here as well that as an example of the successful implementation of anti-corruption actions for the centers of Ministry of Internal Affairs, only 6% claimed that they faced corruption in Ministry of Internal Affairs service centers. This is quite good. Yes. Then the next point, next slide is related to the business. Do I understand that it's from the perspective of business? Yes, this is true, and I'd like to tell that these are shares from those who have contacted with the civil servants and officials. So among leaders, here we see customs. 35% of those who had contacts with customs claimed that they faced corrupt practices. In top three, we also see construction and land relations. Every third person had claimed that corruption was in relations in this sphere. And again, to top three list, we have included services of electricity, gas, water supply, and sewage systems. So we also see that these indicators haven't changed comparing to the previous year. So leaders haven't changed, unfortunately. And the next slide, we have the statistics on top corruption practices in higher education. And here I'd like to invite Mr. Savchuk to the word. Yes, we have a few more slides with numbers as to the corruption practices, especially the average. So higher education is a more corrupt area. That's why we have included it on the separate slide. Usually we face such cases in coursework and essays preparation and defending, and on some regarding passing exams and regarding practices. We see that in general indicators have decreased, but we have also evaluated number of different practices which haven't been included in the slide, but if we would talk about the corrupt practices in general, we would see that 32% of the population of Ukraine, of those who have who had contacts with the higher education, found themselves in corrupt situations. And yes, and the next slide is about medicine, about healthcare field. It's a very painful issue for all the Ukrainian. Please, could you please tell us a bit about corruption practices here? Yes, it looks like that this area is one of the most relevant for each of us, because we all face healthcare system from time to time, and it looks like that every fifth person or third person found themselves in corruption situations. These are in cases when during treatment or surgical procedures, in cases of procurement of conditions of stay in a medical institution, and also there are issues related to childbirth, but we see some improvements comparing to previous years, but in general, a third of the population found themselves in corrupt situations. And the next area is construction and land relations and corruption practices in this field. Yes, here we also see everything related to the land regarding its privatization or regarding its registration or documentation preparation or approval of documentation on commissioning of housing. We also see on this slide the practice of receiving funds from authorities for the restoration of destroyed damaged housing, and we see that 15% respondents have faced such situations and found themselves in corrupt situations. In general, we see that 35% found themselves in corrupt situations in this field.
And now let us move to the customs, which we mentioned already. No, we have one more slide about the construction and land relations. Okay, construction and land relations, sure. So, one more slide and acute issue. Yes, because we have researched not only the population and the business, but also in the construction and land relations is important as well. So there was the business relations as an important issue to understanding in which situations corruption has emerged. And again, during the definition of the rent for the land, when you need to get some permit or license to commission a property object, to transfer the land for use or ownership, to get away or to eliminate some of the restrictions as for the use of the land plot, and for instance when it has changed from the status of the household to the house, and so on. So 37.6% of the people found themselves in corrupt situations. Corruption practices, now we are moving to customs, right? Please. Yes, customs is a very important sphere for business, which has some of the external economic activity. The corruption is substantial here as well, mostly during the customs clearance control, when the customs officer has to define the proper customs regime for goods, or to provide the classification code, or for instance to let the car go without customs clearance. We still see some of the improvements during this year, but 33% of the people who face the customs are in the corrupt practices. And as for the judiciary, the system of the courts, any of the corruption practices in the judiciary, right? Well, unfortunately, we don't see any improvements in this sphere during the last year. Mostly the businesses face corruption in the judiciary when they consider and adjudicate economic cases, when they need to, for instance, recognize the illegal actions, when they need to execute a judgment in favor of an enterprise to avoid responsibility. So altogether, 22% of the people who were dealing with the judiciary found themselves in corrupt situations. situations. So, by the way, this is the answer to the question about the efficiency of the reform, which is going on for more than a year. So we can see that the situation with corruption in Ukraine is not that very nice. In some of the aspects, it is even awful. Ukrainians altogether have negative attitude towards corruption, but when we say that we need to solve some issue with less efforts, just to give a bribe, then sometimes the attitude can be changed. So we have one more slide which will show to what extent, or do they at all, tolerate corruptions, the dynamics of the indicator of the negative attitude of the population and business towards corruption. And could please Volodymyr Kharchenko comment on that? We can clearly say that Ukrainians do not tolerate corruption, and during the recent years we can see a very specific tendency of the positive increase of the indicators of negative attitude towards corruption as the way to solve their own problems of the population or the problems of the enterprise for the business. So they don't use corrupt practices, they don't give bribes, and they don't use connections to solve the issue which would be important for them. In 2022, these indicators grew, and for business they are 60%, for the population 57%. We need to mention that for the population the growth is even bigger, 8% in comparison with 5% for the business. So altogether I'd like to conclude that Ukrainians can clearly see corruption as an issue for the state. Ukrainians do not tolerate corruption. However, the level of the dissemination of corrupt practices in some of the spheres is still very high, and the problem exists. The task to solve it has been reflected in the State Anti-Corruption Program. Thank you. Thank you, and I, from my behalf, would like to thank Volodymyr Kharchenko, the analyst of the National Agency on Prevention of Corruption, and Dmytro Savchuk, the head of the research agency InfoSapiens. Thank you. So we were saying that the request for the overcoming of corruption is there. It is very insistent and it exists for a long time. So now we came closer to the presentation itself of the State Anti-Corruption Program. So I'm giving the floor to Andriy Vishnevsky, Deputy Head of the National Agency on Prevention of Corruption Prevention. Andriy, we had previously a short conversation, so we calculated, as far as I remember, because I'm talking to the politicians for 20 years about corruption, and you will not believe me, but the first anti-corruption program of Yanukovych times of 2011 in 2014 existed. That state program, in fact, had the investment of 820 million hryvnia, and it was just pure imitation, nothing more. Then the Ukrainians paid colossal price for that. The process started when we paid a colossal price at Maidan, and in 2014 one more program of the state anti-corruption program was adopted, 2014-2017. Right? Please correct me if I'm wrong. Which launched the anti-corruption infrastructure. It created all the necessary authorities like NABU, SAP, and all the anti-corruption institutions. So today we are speaking about the State Anti-Corruption Program for 2023-2025. Andriy, could you please tell what's the peculiarity of the today's State Anti-Corruption Program, and how can we not imitate this reform anymore? Oh, you need to turn it on. Good morning. What is the price of the program of Yanukovych program? We all know it, the Revolution of Dignity, which swept away Yanukovych. It made our justice feeling very acute and sharp, and the requirements of the society grew towards the different approaches, including overcoming corruption. So corruption was one of the first reasons why the Revolution of Dignity took place. You were totally right, Miroslava, when you mentioned that one of the responses against the societal requirement in the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, was declared the anti-corruption strategy and the state anti-corruption program, the outcome of which has become the shaping of what we now name anti-corruption infrastructure. First and foremost, two components of the system of criminal justice like NABU and SAP, and also mostly about the Anti-Corruption Policy Authority and Prevention of Corruption, that is the National Agency on Corruption Prevention. And by the way, the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court has been created beyond the implementation of that strategy. That is why, even from this perspective, we can consider and agree the opinion of Vera above, that it is not part of the anti-corruption infrastructure, the court, but still it is included into the complex of the measures which the state does to prevent corruption. So, in comparison with the previous strategy, the new strategy before 2005 and the state anti-corruption program are including for the first time the component with the prevention of corruption in different sectors of state policy. And this is the novelty, in fact, this is the peculiarity. If we look at the structure of the strategy and state anti-corruption program, we will see three main blocks. The first and the third blocks, in fact, are going on and developing what was founded within the previous strategy, that is, institutional system of corruption countering and some of the measures for the improvement of the procedural and material legal points which are necessary to provide the irreversibility, inevitability and responsibility for corruption. But the new component is number 2. It is created for the significant reduction in corruption practices in 15 priority policy areas. That is why I said novelty about this element of the state anti-corruption program. When we launched the procedures of the approval of the draft of this program with different ministries and central executive branch authorities, very often we faced a certain misunderstanding and even a bit of a distant attitude. Some of the people told us, you need to deal with prevention of corruption, and we are dealing with certain spheres, agrarian policy or education or healthcare. Why do you? What do you have in common with our spheres? Go on and prevent corruption and do your functions. We know what to do in our spheres. We are the experts here. We don't have any corruption. And it really illustrates the necessity of the special emphasis on the corruption prevention in certain spheres, because we are now considering a working hypothesis that corruption prevention starts as the quality of the state policy, because high-quality state policy minimizes opportunities for corruption. It minimizes opportunities for the corrupt practices, which we were told by the sociologists and analysts of the national agency, and then we will see how the state anti-corruption program responds the issues which the society pays attention to and which the solutions it claims. Andrei, then I would ask you to explain what you mean when you say quality of state policy. What does it mean, just in simple words? In simple words, it means that the state policy in the certain spheres of societal life, in the certain spheres of economy, should be to minimize the opportunities for the unjust or corrupt state officials, representatives of the business, which unfortunately exist, and the citizens as well, to get into corrupt relations. So in fact, the next slide tells us a bit more what the state program is. It is created to solve 73 policy problems which are identified by the anti-corruption strategy. It is aimed at achieving 271 expected strategic outcomes, and it includes more than 1,000 of activities and more than 90 implementing actors. Those are not only ministries but other authorities as well. The authorities which in fact are the system of justice, and including the Supreme Council of Justice and the Qualification Commission of the Judges and the Prosecutor General's Office and so on. It is important to understand that the State Anti-Corruption Program is not a document of any of the authorities. This is the document which concerns the whole system of state authorities in Ukraine, and each and every level has its own tasks, its own periods of time when these tasks should be accomplished, and the most important, there are some of the planned strategic outcomes which we need to achieve. I'd like to say a couple of words about the system of indicators which are necessary for monitoring and assessment of the implementation of this program. There are two levels of indicators. The indicators which will allow to daily assess the achievement of operational outcomes, for instance, whether it is developed or not developed certain law draft, or the draft of the regulation, whether there has been this or that measure done, whether they developed or not this or that digital product. Do I understand right that any citizen of Ukraine or journalist can can visit the website and check it at some platform? Yes, you're right. We will see further on how it can be done. And the second group of indicators are of the higher level. They are done to assess whether we achieved or not the strategic outcome in the end of the implementation of the state program and the strategy. By the way, the Cabinet of Ministers has even had higher requirements to the performers than we had an idea when we developed the system of indicators. In the original version given to the Cabinet of Ministers, each strategic outcome had the list of certain criteria which are necessary to be achieved to consider the strategic outcome achieved, in fact, and each of that criteria had the weight in percentage. So the picture should be colorful in the end, and you could assess how much the strategic outcome was achieved. But the Cabinet of Ministers decided to be harsh as for the performers, and those weighted indicators were excluded. Now we'll have black and white picture of the achievement of results. So either it is working or not. So the strategic outcome will be considered achieved only when all of the criteria have been complied with. Even if one and only indicator is not achieved, the strategic outcome will not be achieved as well. Maybe the Cabinet of Ministers wanted to encourage more and to increase the responsibility of the performers for the achievement of the strategic outcomes. You promised to show, I think there is a slide here, right, which shows where you can see and check the implementation of the State Anti-Corruption Program. Well, in fact, this slide shows how the State Anti-Corruption Program and the strategy for which it has been created are connected with the problems and practices which we heard about in the previous presentation. I will not read them out loud again, but in spite of the fact that this strategy was developed according to the previous researches, as it has been emphasized by my colleagues, the new research and its outcomes are not that different from the previous one. That is why the problems are the same, and the State Anti-Corruption Program will be created for its achievement. The next slide will show... Could you show the next one? And one more. So how will provide the coordination and monitoring, how the citizens will be able to assess whether the State Anti-Corruption Program is implemented or not? Mr. Nemchinov has spoken about that, and the head of the parliament also mentioned that the law which adopted the anti-corruption strategy foresees the development of the special information system which will allow to provide monitoring of the program. The National Agency on Corruption Prevention, and Volodymyr Kharchenko is one of the inspirations for the system, which we created with the support of the European Anti-Corruption Initiative. It will allow to efficiently manage the implementation of the measures of the program in real time. The national agency will provide monitoring and assessment of the implementation, and the most important, the population, both every citizen and the public organizations which are professionally working in any sphere, they can provide the monitoring, because all the data will be accessible online. All the data will be in the internet. Moreover, this system is interactive. If, for instance, the NGO, which is professionally dealing with education, for instance, or healthcare or land reform, if they do not agree how the agency assessed the implementation. For instance, the agency considers that it is accomplished, but the NGO considers that it is not that accomplished. Then there will be an opportunity to leave a comment, and this comment will be analyzed by the experts of the national agency. Our assessment will be then reconsidered and updated, and in case of necessity, it will be reconsidered, taking into consideration the opinion of the civil society. Thank you. We are really short of time, just a minute left, so I have just time to tell you, if you'd like to look at the outcomes of the sociological research which we discussed, you can use the QR code in your app. You can get there and you will see the data in the agenda. In the agenda there is the QR code. So the main question: what will Ukraine get at the state level if we accomplish the state anti-corruption program? Well, first of all, the decrease of the tolerance towards corruption. We have nice results. Approximately 60% are not ready to get into corrupt relations, but it's not enough. And of course, this indicator should be at least 80 or 90%. And of course, we would like to have it at the level of 100%. This speed up of the economic acceleration of economic growth through digitalization and deshadowing of the economy, we calculated that in case if we implement the program, the society will save annually approximately 200 billion hryvnia, eliminating corruption, the improvement of the investment climate, and transparent and effective recovery. And of course, if we implement everything what we planned in the program, we will have what to say during the dialogue of our acquisition of membership in the EU, NATO and OECD, which are the external political objectives of the Ukrainian state. Thank you, Andriy. So to conclude, unfortunately, in Ukraine, mostly we do not thank the predecessors. I would like to break this tradition. I'd like to thank Ivan Presnyakov, who is today here. That is my predecessor at the position of the deputy head of the national agency. This is the person who's done a lot for Ukraine to have the relevant and high-quality anti-corruption strategy. But first of all, I'd like to thank Dmytro Kalmykov, who is the director of the Department of Anti-Corruption Policy, and his wonderful team, which during the last half of the year, 24/7, where they were working on this program. This is their baby, their product, and they have the very responsible mission to organize its implementation and to help the whole system of authorities of Ukraine to achieve success in the implementation of the program. So please, let us thank them with a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you so much, Andriy Vishnevsky, Deputy Head of the National Agency of Corruption Prevention. I thank all the speakers for the wonderful presentation of the sociology and the presentation of the State Anti-Corruption Program. That was just the beginning. That was appropriately mentioned that anti-corruption program the state anti-corruption program and the strategy are the issues of survival of the country under the conditions of challenges for the defense sector, under the conditions of post-war recovery. It is incredibly important for our European integration. It is decisive for our European integration. And now we will speak about the anti-corruption policy. The anti-corruption program in the priority sphere: defense, infrastructure recovery, digitalization, land, education. I invite to the stage our speakers: Mikhailo Fedorov, Vice Prime Minister on Innovations, Education Development, Science and Technologies, the Minister of Digital Transformation of Ukraine; Roxolana Pidlasa, the Head of the Budget Committee of the Parliament; Mykola Solsky, the Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food of Ukraine, please; Oksen Lisovy, the Minister of Education and Science of Ukraine. Mr. Oksen, hello. Serhiy Derkach, Deputy Minister of the Development of Communities, Territories and Infrastructure, and Oleksiy Reznikov, the Minister of Defense. As far as I understand, he will be a bit late, right? Yes, he will join us soon. So we are waiting for Mr. Reznikov, and we are beginning the conversation. I have the first question to Mikhailo Fedorov. In fact, all of the reforms, all of our life and breakthroughs, which are helping not only for us to live but also to overcome corruption, is digitalization. Do I understand properly that the state anti-corruption programs foresees certain measures as for digitalization as well? Could you please tell about that? The microphone is not working. Okay, it does. Hello, everyone. Yes, really, digitalization is the foundation of anti-corruption strategy. More than 60 points of the program are about digitalization, about information, data sharing, and the improvement of the data in the register. We have done already a lot, which is the foundation for the development of anti-corruption program. And further on, during the following years, we'll have the technological revolution, which will help to fight corruption. I have a very short, if I may, to show. I would tell several cases what has been done in digitalization, how it is working, and how it will be developed. Let me tell you that now Dia app is used by 19 million of users. Why is this figure important for the anti-corruption strategy? Because it's about the culture of digitalization in the society. People are actively using digital technologies. They are ready for digitalization. They are actively involved. We have the certain demand for the changes in the convenient services and filling out the declarations, by the way, the tax declarations. This is the cultural phenomenon which impacts how the state is working, how the state officials are rotated, and in fact the politicians as well, how they begin to design the services which can further lead to different anti-corruption effects. So now when we think about the launch of the service, we think how it should be launched online. And the rules of digitalization is the opportunity to avoid in the future any of the corrupt effects. Annually, we have the research which has been done in the economic effect and anti-corruption effect, which allows us to be more precise next year. If we analyze the outcomes for the previous year, you can see the figures on the screen. Billions of hryvnia, you can see them. For instance, I can mention our work in the sphere together with the Ministry of Recovery and Regional Development, with someone who is the head of the agency, and he used to deal with construction before. The reform of the construction sphere as it is, how we digitalized everything there, and we go on with that. There are some of the spheres which need to be finalized. We need the law to be signed and certain decrees to be taken, but 70% of the sphere is already digitalized, and I will tell about that a bit later. The economic effect also leads to the registration of the sole proprietor or e-baby Yamalatko service, because it's all about time. The people from the remote villages needed to get to the region center to register their business, but now they can do that in 10 minutes and they don't need to waste several days to have this service. The same is about the e-baby program. When you don't need to give the bribe to register your baby and to get 10 services connected with that, you can do that quickly and online. Taking into consideration how many services like that are launched annually or even monthly, all of that leads to anti-corruption and economic effect. As for digitalization of the construction, those are the principles within the anti-corruption strategy, and we will stick to them. First of all, our team definitely believes that the best service is the service without people, without the human beings, without state officials. It should be automated. The data should be checked automatically from the registers without the human factor and error when the person assesses whether this service can be provided or not, or just guesses whether this decision is taken or not. So that is why the digitalization of construction showed that we had billions of corruption in this sphere. Any permit meant a bribe. But when we started this reform in 2020, the register was in private hands in Europe, and manually we had to use the exploitation of any of the premises. But now we follow the digital trace and we can find any potential corrupt risks. Dozens of thousands of the users of this system are taking these decisions mostly automatically, and after the adoption of all of the laws, and I think that it will take place this year, technically we are ready for that, the whole sphere will function with the minimal involvement of people, of human beings and state officials. The interesting case is also the e-hospital certificates, because when you in fact order this certificate at the website with the sick certificate and medical leave, we solved this issue launching the service of medical leave, which are now working in our country. We assess the economic effect for 4 billion in our country, and we have 13 million in the country. Now you cannot buy the sick certificate, and it used to be a very corrupt sphere. And also the creation of the unified register of social payments. This is a very important reform with an opportunity to verify all the social payments, to understand where they are efficient or not, and to save lots of money. We assess that together with the Ministry of Finance we save a huge percentage of payments because this is the first victory. This project is very complicated because we had to stop the project which was working before that, which included corrupt risks. And of course there are first outcomes. The first service is fully automated about the IDPs, internally displaced persons. We launched it in this unified register without any human error and factor. 99% of successful transactions are in this service. What we'll do this year, and it is included by the anti-corruption program, this year and during the next years, the transparency of the recovery. We have the register of destroyed and damaged property. It is important for us and for our international partners who are helping us financially, because we can follow the movement of any of the applications about the damaged property in the register, from the application in DIA app to the register and the work of the Commission. We will go on working on this project, and it is working already. E-excise. This is also the sphere which we couldn't solve for many years, but now the law draft is adopted in the first reading, and we are working on the unified information system. I do hope this law will be adopted in the second reading, and the next year we'll launch the e-excise system in our country. Any of us will be able to check alcohol or tobacco products, and then it will be upscaled. We'll be able to check whether it is legal, whether it's not counterfeit, and so on. Automatic services for sailors. It used to be a huge issue in our country. We are working on that together with the Ministry of Recovery. We'll solve the issue of the certification of sailors, and the customs clearance in DIA app, because we'd like to show how in the customs offices we can get rid of the human factor, the customs officer, and to fully automate the service provision. I'm sure that it will be the first step for this kind of a snowball of reforms when the automation in the customs office will be organically and quickly developing. That's what we are planning to do during the following months, and anti-corruption strategy takes into consideration verification and information sharing. Thank you, Mikhailo. I am so sorry to interrupt you. That was so interesting, but I just remembered as for the trust issues. I do remember this distrust of the population towards DIA app. There were so many questions to you during live airs, but people got used to that so quickly. So as far as I understand, the activity of your ministry is connected with the activity of all of the ministries, because the whole anti-corrupt policy will be connected to digitalization. So Mikhailo has already mentioned about the recovery and rebuilding of infrastructure. I have the question to Serhiy Derkach, Deputy Minister of the Development of Communities, Territories and Infrastructure of Ukraine. How does the state anti-corruption program and digitalization will decrease the corruption risks in your sector? As far as I understand, it will be a very close cooperation, definitely, because we have several products which we, together with the Ministry of are implementing. That is the register of the destroyed property, which was mentioned by Mikhailo above, and the e-system of the recovery management. But it's not only about digitalization, it's also about the analysis and assessment of corruption risks in each of the processes, starting with the analysis of losses and going on with a certain project of the funding of the project, and then the control of the quality and implementation of this project. So at each of these components and stages of the reconstruction and rebuilding will assess corruption risks and minimize the risks which we will find. And definitely in this issue we'll get help from the e-systems, which will minimize corruption risks with the help of the decrease of human factor in the work in the reconstruction sphere. And instantly the question to Mykola Solsky, the Minister of Agrarian Policy and Food of Ukraine. How does the state anti-corruption program impact the efficiency of the regulation of land relations? We just saw the statistical data on the perception and level of corruption in the sphere of land relations, and the situation so far is not that nice and hopeful. So how will the state anti-corruption program regulate this sphere? So look, unfortunately I didn't see the statistical data, but during the last 3 or 4 years the situation has changed. I'm totally sure in that, and I can debate with anyone, including the author of these statistical data, because the authorities in the land management is given to the local communities. The opportunities to management the lands is done through auctions. It is the free privatization is banned since April last year, so the situation is totally different. How it is it interconnected? They are done simultaneously, in fact, in parallel, and the adoption of the laws in 2 committees have been approved very frequently. Transparency in the construction sphere is obviously important, and we need transparency in land relations before that. The strategy, it is good as a focus, and I'm sure that lots of ministries have partially implemented it. Some of the documents are almost ready. It was never done just in vain, because I do remember that we debated a lot with the National Agency on Corruption Prevention when this strategy has been adopted, and it is well thought through. That is why, yes, of course, it will help.
Thank you very much. I now have a question to Oksen Lisovy, the Minister of Education of Ukraine. So Mr. Vishnevsky, when presenting the state anti-corruption program, mentioned that this program is the quality of state policy. How can you comment on this statement? how do you understand the quality of state policy in your field, in the field of education? What is the quality of state policy for you? I have a deep convincement that real combat with corruption could be done only through the education. If we want to combat this phenomenon, we have to look at how do we work with the youth, starting from school, from universities, and what the policy should be here. First of all, this is the introduction of programs of civil education, and they should comprise this issue of anti-corruption in such a manner so they will clearly understand how the corruption is related to their well-being in the future. And the second angle in the corruption and existence of state. If we are talking about the decolonization, we have to remember that the corruption is an instrument, is a tool of decolonization. This is something that we've taught to tolerate, and only the tools used throughout the educational process could help eradicate these phenomenon. So when we see the tolerance of corruption is being the corruption is being tolerated, it's actually when some person, young child, comes to the educational establishment and sees corruption there. That's why we have to think about educational programs in such a way so they will include the issues of anti-corruption matters. These proposals are formulated in our work, articulated in our documents, and now today preparing to this event, I already see some options, some issues which could be further strengthened. These are preparation of pedagogues, teachers, their requalification, and the development of specialized programs for secondary school, because already at this stage it is possible to introduce respective issues which will help to form respective understanding in youth, and also in higher education, because in higher education we have lots of them. Thank you very much for this. I will have more questions to our guest, Roxolana Pedlasa. Good morning. I'm sorry for not asking questions to you for such long. Roxolana, could you tell us, please, why the parliament was so slow in voting for such an important legislation? We didn't have the strategy for a few years. Why we had such serious deliberations regarding that? Because the parliament is very serious about anti-corruption strategy, isn't it? It's only a half joke. Let's accept it. We can approach anti-corruption strategy differently. First of all, it could be a declarative document, and usually we saw that such strategies, when they are adopted at the level of the cabinet minister and the parliament, they were usually like that. But as to the anti-corruption strategy, the members of parliament were very serious about it, because they thought it as a guidance for actions, and all the provisions will have to be implemented, and all the political power forces really don't like the additional attention to these issues, and it was very difficult to adopt this program. I know that in order to adopt this strategy, you had to reach some trade-offs. Are there any things you are pity about that these elements, these points haven't been included into the anti-corruption strategy? Did you have to sacrifice anything? I have no pities to anything we have sacrificed with, because this is a very good signal to our international partners. But thanks to our international partners, everything we had to do the parliament and the government will implement and realize? Because we have a memorandum with the International Monetary Fund, for example, and we have to implement this document, and it implies a lot of anti-corruption issues. I know that international partners are now not willing to publicly push Ukrainian officials to do some things, because they have to understand, first of all, their population. Why do they provide so many funds to Ukraine? What do you think? Is it a threat for Ukraine in terms of reform implementation, especially in anti-corruption direction? There are threats, of course. I wouldn't name them threats as they are, because if we're talking about the funds which are being provided to the state budget of Ukraine, and this is a field of my expertise. Here we cooperate voluntarily with the international partners, and first of all with the US government and with the EU in terms of the control of these funds. I know that the Ministry of Finance and State Treasury Service are very open, and they allow auditors, independent auditors from the international partners, which is being provided directly to the public budget, and these audit reports are all available to donors and funds providers. As a state, we are very proactive here, and we don't need, at least at this stage, definitely with this government and with this head of the Treasury Service of Ukraine, we don't have to have any extra commitments or responsibilities from the top in order to be open and transparent and to control utilization of these funds. But definitely we have issues, we have problems related to public procurements. Unfortunately, we don't have the Ministry of Defense here, but as to the defense procurements which utilize public funds, which is the half of the expenditures of the state budget of Ukraine, are going to the defense procurements. They are confidential, they are closed, and we managed in the parliament, and I hope that is a very good step that we've made, at least the first step, that we will disclose the price for one item of goods, but Ministry of Defense has got a mandate to prolong their existing contracts for 1 year, and they haven't supported the idea on setting thresholds, top thresholds for food items which they purchase. I think that this is not a very good signal, that it is not very good in terms of the transparency perspective, which we recommended in this regard. With regards to the public procurements in general, which are not defense related, my personal proposal that we have to return to the differentiation of the territories. I mean here the territories of Ukraine which are not the territories where active hostilities take place, and I think, in my opinion, that they can return to normal mode of operation of public procurement legislation, and we will have the further discussions in the parliament regarding that. Mr. Fedor, we have started discussion with you that the digitalization is one of the main tools of dealing with the corruption. So digitalization is about eliminating human beings in fields which could generate corruption. As a person who is the main driver of this work, can you please tell us what who was hindering this process? Yes, we usually see the resistance, and the process is being hindered because of different issues. For the latest example, customs clearance through DIA app. If you're talking about the corruption, we have to understand what is the root of the problem. We have to look into the details and to try to understand where the corruption happens. Because, for example, if it's a service, we have to understand at which stage the corruption takes place. The same relates to the car custom clearance. This field is now works in such a way that the customs officer can just look at the car and say that the price is okay or not okay, and to apply some fine or take a bribe and to decrease the price of the car. We have re-engineered the service in general and avoided this decision-making factor of the customs officer. And here we have a resistance. The law is not being adopted. There are many thoughts why it cannot be done, and it's difficult to say if it's the vested interest of some group of companies or what. And it's very easy to understand that we can just call to people who work in this field and ask how much money should be paid as a bribe to conduct the customs clearance. But in our case, we had a situation when MPs just left the parliament building because of some event. It's very difficult to say why this resistance occurs, but it occurs. And why I have started my speech from the number 11 million people who use the app. Our app helps us to talk to those who don't want to pay bribes. Every resistance becomes weaker when we try to fight it. And when adopting laws, we have to conduct a lot of discussions with the society, and all after that, the laws are being adopted. And sometimes some leaders appear in the parliament and they try to push forward the adoption, but sometimes nobody applies any flexible techniques, and it's not possible to see any movement here. And sometimes we just launch some service which is anti-corruptive, and it helps to limit corruption even without any resistance. So resistance will be all the time. We will see it for sure. But we have to continue re-engineering services to provide explanation and to work with those who are resistant. We have 3 ministers here, and we are waiting for Alexei Reznikov. Yet we have 3 ministers here. Can I ask you, we have different people in this audience. Some of them are prepared, some of them not. Can you explain in simple words what are the largest problems with corruption in your ministries, where it is very difficult to change something? Maybe the anti-corruption program provides for some tools to do that. So can you tell us about your fields of expertise, your ministries? Let's start from Mykola Solsky. What is the largest problem you have in your ministry? I'm not very sure, but I think that we are successful in almost all fields, and we need to support one of the reforms we were tasked with. Us, we would need sometimes. What do you mean? Some problems, some issues. Are there any people who are against or how it goes? Is this program and strategy is a tool to overtake that? State program is a strategic document, but to do something we need specific actions to be made. So what I've seen from my experience, so there are light and active people, they just don't understand these bureaucratic procedures, and with time we may see different transformations. Either they will just get used to bureaucratism and they will try to use bureaucratic instruments to move things and to change things, because it's usually you just can't come up with an idea and implement it. You have to prepare the idea, discuss it on some conference, and then in some committees at the level of the government, and so on and so on. The National Agency of Corruption Prevention has a good thing. They collected a lot of stories and cases, and they claim that if something is not being changed, then responsible person should explain why nothing is changed. And from my experience, this is a huge amount of work. We've heard today already that there are problems with adoption of respective legislative acts. But why this program anti-corruption program, is important from my side of view? This is it. The second point is regarding the corruption. It could be different. We can have systematic, household level, or occasional, or spontaneous, and in my opinion there are different approaches to combat it. There are stories when corrupt people we actually see stories when corrupt people are not actually decision makers, and sometimes they are being brought to responsibility because somebody observed their behavior and then reported. But sometimes, of course, we see decision makers who are corrupt people, and these are more complicated stories because on the side of the decision maker, you see that the idea is good, that you do everything fine, and it is very well developed. We will do support you, but then they provide you support for 3 or 4 years, and they try to hinder the process. As Mr. Mikhailo Fedorov mentioned, the situation with customs clearance of cars. This is something from my experience, which what I have seen, and from this point of view, the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, they have a lot of other work, but they actually great people, that they have a lot of energy, and they have decided to make this work more organized. I would kindly ask you to be more brief. Mr. Lisovy, could you please tell us, you have just recently came to your position, and you already see, I suppose, what are the most problematic issues in terms of the risks for corruption. I will concentrate my attention on the issue of forming the intolerance to corruption in education in general. But we will of course look at corruption in higher educational institutions, secondary schools. We have more than 60,000 estate properties and more than 100,000 hectares of land plots in education system. So these are also departments licensing educational institutions, and we will have to think how to do that. I'm grateful to previous ministers who have done huge work in order to tackle the corruption issues in the enrollment process, and I personally put a lot of attention on how the bodies which ensure the quality of education work. Their creation is very on time, but let's look to the roots. The higher education as of today, as of today, the higher educational institution is all about getting diploma, not about getting knowledge. So the motivation of people is just to get the diploma. Nobody is expecting to get knowledge. So the root of the problem here is to reform the educational system in general, to transform it into the tool of obtaining knowledge and qualification. And only after that, the risks of corruption at other levels will be decreased significantly. Also, we will have to integrate digitalization tools to the educational area, to the higher education, to the education for foreign citizens, because we'd like to launch the provision of our unique experience to foreign students. We have a year of war, and that will be an education for soldiers, for military engineering, and other areas. So here, the digitalization of work with foreign students will be important, and also separation of all that functions which relate to licensing. They should be separated and put to different bodies which should be responsible. Thank you very much, Oksana, and Mr. Derkach. I'd like also ask to you. You maybe have the most problematic ministry, but I would like to specify my question. How the state anti-corruption program would support the post-war recovery? Are there any tools for that? Because we all understand that post-war recovery, it will be a very difficult story. Thank you very much for your question. It is very pleasant for me to be here today, because when I worked at National Agency of Corruption Prevention, I was personally involved into preparing the draft of the anti-corruption strategy and program, and there are two very important aspects. I am already in the context of the details of which are underlying the corruption strategy and program, and also the second aspect that actually I was personally involved. That's why I can say that there is nothing wrong in this strategy, and we will have to implement it as quick as possible. When I came to the ministry, my first task was to get ready to prepare that. There are a number of important issues which should be covered here. This is the issue of city building and reconstruction and rebuilding of roads. And these two issues, I hope we will be able to solve them with the anti-corruption program and strategy, because pricing and purchases for these areas are very corruption-generated streams. Also, the bigger part of this work should be implemented with the respective bylaws, and the second bigger part of this work would be the digitalization, because the anti-corruption program will be very efficient if we will complement it with the digitalization tools. Anti-corruption program is a very good guide which explains us how can we combat the corruption, but it shouldn't be an exclusive tool. We shouldn't have to base our work only on basis of this document, because it wasn't possible to assess all the risk and to include them into the corruption program. In our ministry, we have a lot of other corrupt spheres on certification and transportation, border crossing points. They are also one of them, and we will be dealing with them. So preventing the corruption is a personal responsibility of every citizen of our country, in public and in the private sector. And keeping this thought in mind, we will be able to change our country for the better. Thank you, colleagues. We have only 4 minutes till the beginning, and Roxolana would like to say a very brief remark, and after that we will give a floor to Alexei Reznikov. Yes, as to the recovery, in the process of recovery, there a special law on monitoring, audit, and control could be very beneficial. We have a commitment of the minister, Vice Prime Minister on recovery, to develop such a draft law, and it should legalize in the Ukrainian legislation tools for the control in the process of recovery, and also to introduce tools for management of recovery. It would be so to say ProZorro for the recovery. I will not ask a long question to Mr. Reznikov to save time. I will briefly ask you how the anti-corruption program would work in your area, and how it will help your area with the procurement of different items. Very briefly, I was one of those who was engaged into the adoption of this program. It was very seriously deliberated, and with Andriy Alexander we were in one team, and now, and I was already involved into adoption of this program at the level of the government, so I was one of those who was pro that program and strategy. I have already signed all the bureaucratic things which are necessary to launch the implementation of this program in our ministry, and the respective department, Mr. Stepanyan, they already have all the mandates and guidances, and we have our own priorities. Yes, of course, they are related to land plots, because there are a lot of issues here, and housing and defense procurements and many other things. As one of the main bodies responsible for defense policy, we will cover also educational and training programs and former military commissariats and other things. I couldn't even imagine how many problems with corruption could be here in this ministry. But in my understanding, corruption is not only a legal concept. Sometimes it is being narrowed to the bribe only. But in general, it is a corrosion of the system. It's a deterioration of the system. So for me, it is a priority to create an environment in which effective tools will be used and implemented. So the plan is a tool with list of tools which should be implemented, and we have almost 25 bylaws which should be adopted at the level of ministers. Some of them will not be introduced as of the moment. Control of fuels, for example, is not control and monitoring of fuels. It's not a very good idea during the wartime, because otherwise our enemy will have extra information. But we have the program of actions we should undertake, and we will prepare all the procedures and all the documents which are necessary. And once the parliament says the martial law is over, we will. So this is the president who has to tell us that, yes, but we as the Defense and Security Council, we inform the president that martial law should be over, and then the parliament is voting for that. Yes, this is very briefly. I'm sorry for being late, but yes, I think we will have Q&A session now. Yes, now we are going to have, we are a bit behind of our schedule in 3 minutes. Now we are going to have a very brief session of question and answers for 10 minutes, even less, and our schedule is very tight, so 30 seconds for the question and 1 minute for the answer. Friends, please keep it simple. 30 seconds for the question and 1 minute for the answer. The reporters, please keep your questions, and you will be able to ask them during the break. You will have the time during the break for that. And now we are waiting for the question from experts and activists. Those who are in the hall, please raise your hands, and I will give you a floor, please.
Hello, Anti-Corruption Headquarters, Sergei Matkal. I have the question to Sergei Reznikov. The Parliament has already adopted, and the representative of the Parliament mentioned, they adopted the law draft on the publication of prices for the non-military products, but the Ministry of Defense did not provide any of the regulations procedures. When shall we see the prices in ProZorro system about all of the goods and products? Because we, as the public sector, would like to monitor, to see, and to search for corruption at ProZorro. Thank you. Thank you for your question. I'd like to drive your attention to the fact that we were one of the initiators of the adoption of this law, and we asked to do it at two committees. So we thank the Parliament that we are moving in this direction together. Without waiting for the voting of this law and signing of it by the President, we published the prices at the Ministry website during the second reading of this law draft, but we have the working group under the Yulia Svorodenko head, which is still working. The outcome of this work should be the decree to ProZorro system to make for us our internal Prozorro resource. I am just formally saying it's military Prozorro. It's a working name because we need technical solutions. There are some of the points which Prozorro cannot provide us with in our request. We were mentioning that during our working group and during the meeting with our Prime Minister last Saturday. We mentioned that as well. So as for me, there won't be any delays, but it's important for the experts in Prozorro to open a portal for us. So there won't be any delays. Thank you. Any other questions? Could you raise your hand, please? Are there questions? Please. Good day, Mikhailo Serebryakov, Executive Director of the organization Together Against Corruption. The question to the Minister of the Education. I congratulate you and my condolences, because this is a very hard work. So, as for anti-corruption program, one of its elements in science and academia is the development of the National Repository of the Academic Tasks, the open, transparent database of the 90% of the theses and other dissertations. Your predecessor has adopted a wonderful decree that this repository with all of the texts have to be automatically indexed by the internet Google searches and other anti-plagiarism apps, because it will improve the checks against plagiarism, because we have more PhDs and doctors of sciences than the quality of their work. Unfortunately, in half of the year this decree was never done by the National Technical and our institute, especially about the anti-corruption component in science. So does the Ministry of Education have readiness to implement this decree and to reform this repository to have anti-plagiarism checks? Okay, please, the questions should be shorter. So, the academic integrity is in the focus of our attention, including digital tools. It concerns the change of the culture of academic integrity, but without the toolkit, it cannot be implemented. I'm sure that we will be able to find necessary money for the modernization. The system which exists now is not efficient. It does not show objective outcomes. That is why, yes, definitely, I will analyze the decree which has been adopted. Honestly speaking, I still did not read it, but it is in our priority, I promise. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Could you raise your hands if there are any questions? Yes, please. Then I'd like to pose a question to the Minister of Agrarian Policy. The main task is to rebuild Ukraine and to attract investments. When the investor is coming to Ukraine, he or she would like to launch activity and needs land. This is a full of corruption risks point, and if we don't create the investment climate to involve investors and to give them the opportunity to work, we will never get investments to the country. What does the ministry do for that, for the investors to come? How do they protect it? And altogether, what is the strategy of the policy as for the involvement and attraction of the investors into the agrarian sphere? Mykola Solsky, please. Well, look, it's important for the experts and to investments to speak about that. We have the land market, as you know, right? We have the opportunity to change the target of the use of the land, and this mechanism is simpler 10 times more than 10 years ago. We have wide authorities of the local communities. We have initiatives on the maximum simplification of the changes of target use of the land. And there is an initiative from the presidential office, which is really a nice one. Unfortunately, it did not find support of the parliament first, but it will this year, I guess. And again, as for the requirement, there are no, in fact, limits in acquiring land. So please register the company and you can acquire land plots. So as for my opinion about the issues connected with the foreign investors, this is more the issue of the protection of their investments from cases connected which sometimes emerge after the business has been launched, not only during its being start up. There is lots of work and there are lots of questions to the judicial and to the law enforcement and so on. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Now we'll have the communication with the media. I thank the participants of the panel discussion, the ministers, Roxolana Pidlasa, for this conversation. The media will communicate in the neighboring room. Olena will show you where to get to. She is raising her hand and she will show you where to go to. And the ministers who have such an opportunity will join the media now. Please, thank you everyone.
повертатися і займати свої місця в залі.
Я зазвичай відповідаю, просто наприклад, дуже тяжко в неділю, бо це той день, коли я намагаюся працювати мамою.
Прошу повертатися до залу, шановні гості презентації. Тоді треба, щоб хтось там сказав. Прошу повертатися, будь ласка, до зали, займати свої місця, займати спікерів. Прошу займати свої місця на сцені, і ми продовжуємо. Наступна дискусійна панель буде дуже цікава, вона буде стосуватися антикорупційних інституцій. Просто можна попросити, щоб зменшили, бо це охолоджує, це кондиціонер.
Я відчуваю, що це війна.
Так? Це треба...
Свої руки.
Просто на прес-підході там міністри і тому.
Друзі, прошу заходити до залу і вже починаємо наступну дискусійну панель. Я почуваю себе як спікер парламенту, який заганяє депутатів на голосування.
А вони працюють?
Отже, всі промовці є, тому я думаю, що
So we have all of the speakers, so I guess that we will start in an instant. Please take your seats, not to go and have any conversations during the discussion.
отже,
So, I welcome again all of the guests of the presentation of the State Anti-Corruption Program. I welcome all of us who are watching us online. Our following panel discussion concerns anti-corruption institutions and their further development. Anti-corruption institutions are so important and they can be critical to overcome corruption, and also they can be really harmful if they lose societal legitimacy and trust. I welcome the participants of this discussion panel. That is Semen Krivonos, the director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Hello. Andriy Sinuk, Deputy Head of Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, Prosecution. Hello. Markian Halabala, the Judge of the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court. Anastasia Radina, the Head of the Parliament Committee on the Issues of Anti-Corruption Policy. Hello, Anastasia. And Irina Shiba, Deputy Head of Anti-Corruption Initiative of the European Union. Hello, Irina. Thank you for finding time for the conversation. So, to each of you, I have some of the questions, but I will begin to speak about the institution with the overall question. Doesn't it seem to you And I would ask you to answer as short as possible. Doesn't it seem to you that anti-corruption policy is very hard to be implemented in the society which does not have trust, enough of trust, either to the law enforcement system or the courts or the prosecutors or the investigation, and even they lack trust to the anti-corruption institutions? When the society decides on its own, those are ours, those are not ours, those people can do whatever they want, but others will be not trusted, will be hated, and so on. So we don't have enough of trust into institutions. Can the society judge? Can it provide the moral verdict? And what do you think about that? How can this trust somehow be gained? Let us start with Semen Krivonos. Where's your mic? A wonderful question. Thank you, all of the presentees. I thank you for the invitation, for the wonderfully organized event, for the opportunity to express my position, and especially to answer such an important question. The society does not only have the right to judge and assess the efficiency of anti-corruption system as it is, and the state authorities as they are. This is the main consumer of the reform, the main judge of this reform, and the main mood of the society, of the majority of the society, is the main marker or indicator of the efficiency of the reform. If the society does not trust the anti-corruption institutions, or its level of trust towards anti-corruption institutions does not satisfy the expectations of the institutions themselves, this is the issue of the institutions and communication with the society. That is why we need to assess, not to be offended by that, but to provide very specific conclusions and to form our strategy, including the communicational one, basing upon the reality what we saw on the screen, especially as for the research of the trust of the society to the anti-corruption authorities. Thank you, Andriy Senyuk, please. Thank you. I agree that maybe this is the part of our job, which is to comprehensively explain what we are doing and to highlight the outcomes of our activity. The recovery or the building of this trust is our task. I would say it would be easier to tell. We need to tell about complicated things in simpler words, because the fight against corruption is not always simple. It's not just how to discover the perpetrator of the theft when you can see who took something. The corruption is much more complicated. Those schemes are much harder to understand. So communication is your answer. Okay, Markian Halabala, your answer, please. Answering directly your question, Miroslava, yes, it is hard. It is hard to be the part of the authorities who have the task to fight against corruption, when the society is in the state of loyal attitude towards corruption. This is the question, what can be done with that? What was the first, the hen or the egg? So if this problem exists, we need to solve it. Understanding and stating that, we need to look into tomorrow and not to wait until the society changes its attitude towards corruption, or will develop the critical attitude towards this infrastructure. We need to do our work, to accomplish our work as publicly as possible, and it will change the situation. Thank you, Anastasia Radina. Good day. It seems to me your question already includes the answer. We need to gain trust. Of course, it's so hard to gain, especially in the situation which, according to my impression, includes that the average citizen would like to see the perpetrators tomorrow in jail, doesn't want to know that the high-quality anti-corruption investigation lasts for 5 years. And I understand the people. I would like to have the luxury to have the this attitude, but unfortunately this is not the reality how the anti-corruption authorities are working. So this is the communications issue, the issue of work in advance. And of course we need to close the gaps which we can still see in the legislation and the practice of its implementation, which are also unfortunately helping us to understand that the average investigation could last for 5 or even 7 years, and before just between the comprehension of the person and finally the verdict, so many years can pass. So answering your question, we need communication and we need to close the gaps in the legislation which we mentioning for such a long time but which still exist. Thank you. Irina Shiba, what do you think about that? In fact, I will follow up the opinion of my colleagues. First of all, outcomes. Secondly, communications. Because, of course, we can communicate everything wonderfully, but what is really expected from the anti-corruption infrastructure and the court by the citizens are the honest verdicts as soon as possible. And I need to agree with Anastasia that really there are so many obstacles, including legislative obstacles, which don't give the opportunity for the anti-corruption institutions to work as efficiently as possible and to speed up the consideration of those cases. I'm sure we will discuss them today. Okay, thank you. We will start with the question to the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Semen, we are presenting the State Anti-Corruption Program. What does it have in itself which helps you improve the indicators, improve your work? I know that, for instance, the State Anti-Corruption Program increases the number of detectives. What else? What will help you as a bureau? Yes, really. The State Anti-Corruption Program foresees several structural milestones which we need to strive for, including the increase of the efficiency of the work of our bureau. And that is also the staff of detectives, which introduces the amendments to the line law, and also this number of detectives should be increased for 300 people. And also the creation of the State Expert Institution at the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Why are those 2 points important? Why they are considered to be the most important? First of all, the number of the proceedings which are being investigated in the National Anti-Corruption Bureau is constantly increasing. The corrupt schemes which we are finding out are complicated. They need the involvement of lots of detectives, resources, time, the sending of the requests to the foreign states, and complicated economic expertise. Those schemes are improving all the time. And what's the most important? After our victory, undoubtedly victory, we are waiting for the recovery process, the allocation of substantial money for this process. So before that, we need to get ready, including our anti-corruption infrastructure and the National Anti-Corruption Bureau are ready to organizationally, and we are capable to face those challenges and to provide the efficient investigations of possible abuses in this sphere together with the civil society and other participants of this process. That is why it is so important to increase the staff of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Plus 300 are not only detectives, that is also about operational employees, and not only the ones who are providing analysis, because the analysis and the use of the databases shows that our recent investigations have been substantially based upon the analytical work, especially finding out some of the latest crime organizations. And those were the primary developments of the analysts. So the improvement of the work and strengthening of these departments is one of our top priorities. As for the expert institution, why is that important? Because as of today, this is one of the slowing down factors, one of the obstacles which unfortunately the detectives of the Bureau are facing, and the prosecutors of SAP as well. Because unfortunately, we've got lots of cases of artificial delays or obstacles in some of the expertises which shouldn't be that hard when we calculate the losses. But understanding that the pre-trial investigation is ongoing, and when some time passes by, some of the evidence can be under threat of manipulation, unfortunately, artificial obstacles are being created. So it's important to provide the speed of the pre-trial investigation and its efficiency, and preserving its quality and search of the registration of the evidence of any of the crime activity. It should be communicated with the foreign partners, and we can see it in our activities that the creation of such institutions at the National Anti-Corruption Bureau will significantly increase the capacities of the Bureau and the efficiency in the investigation of crimes. Thank you, thank you. That's it. Let us make it shorter. If you need anything else, we have more questions. We have more questions, for instance, to Markian Halabala. Markian, as for you, as a judge of the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court, why is State Anti-Corruption Program is important? I did not read it all of that. I just looked through it because it has 500 pages, in fact. Why is it important for you? And are there any provisions which are about, in fact, your court? There are lots of cool provisions in the program, and it has become a kind of a compass which we should use where the court should strive for, considering cases connected with corruption. Two main indicators foreseen in the program. First of all, is the simplification and optimization of the criminal proceedings connected with the corruption, because we face lots of issues connected with the lack of number of judges. 3 judges are considering one criminal proceeding, and unfortunately we are facing the procedural sabotage because of the unjust lawyers, and all of that delays the proceedings. And partially I answered the question which you started with. Why exactly there is this lack of trust to anti-corruption structures? The cases are considered for too long. We lack verdicts. And one of the tasks of the anti-corruption strategy and program to give at least partial response to these questions, introducing changes and amendments to the legislation, introducing the one-person consideration of the case, making impossible any of the sabotage of the cases because of the lawyers, and so on. If you allow me, I could compare that between the war with Russian Federation and the war with corruption. We are given weapons to accomplish certain tasks at the battlefield. In the same way, the Anti-Corruption Court, the legislator decided, as the executive branch authorities and legislative branch of authorities, that anti-corruption court should accomplish some of the tasks to consider criminal proceedings quickly and efficiently. Maybe we will have the administrative violations for consideration as well, if they are connected with corruption. But simultaneously, the program gives us an answer how it should be done. Should we provide additional capacities, because this is the additional volume of work, additional burden of work. We support the implementation of those provisions in the program, and we ask to introduce some of the additional ones to increase the number of judges in the court, because it will also increase the capacities to quickly consider the cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Andriy Senyuk, as a representative of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. I know from the media that at the stage of adoption of the anti-corruption strategies, there were huge debates regarding the independence of Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. So what are actually the tools in the State Anti-Corruption Program devoted to Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and what you are lacking? Thank you. In our work, we have faced a number of obstacles which do not allow us to move as quick as we'd like to, and the way we could. investigating cases, and some of them were reflected in this state anti-corruption program. And here I'm talking first of all about mandates of the head of the SACP. For example, when, for example, the head of the SACP is not at the working place, it is not possible to create the group of prosecutors. It should be on the first deputy of the head of the SACP. So the program provides for these technical aspects, and they streamline many processes and may save even some cases. I wouldn't provide specific examples, but I will only mention one of them. Last week, one judge of the Rhine level court was uncovered, and from the moment of the registration of the case in the single register to the moment of the detention, only approximately 2 days passed. And as far as I know, when the that this mechanism actually is working like that, because previously we couldn't achieve such terms. Also in anti-corruption program we see the reflection of the solving of the solution for selection of the head of the SACP, because previously we know from our experience that the competition took almost 2 years, and now, thanks to the program, we will have this procedure improved. There are also a number of provisions which provide for faster pre-court investigations and procedures, and which will also help to involve operative staff to conduct investigations and other important things. Unfortunately, some of the issues were not included into the state anti-corruption program. This is something we have already mentioned about. This is the creation of the establishment of specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office as an independent and a separate institution that would allow to make its work more efficient and to cooperate more efficiently on an international level. But what didn't allow to do that? Unfortunately, we don't know for sure, but these provisions were not included into the state program, but they have been included into the draft law, which is now being registered at the Parliament, and it foresees transformation of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office into a separate legal entity which will remove this problem. I do understand correctly that Anastasia can bring more light about this draft law and what will be fate of this document. First of all, I have to say that one of two key priorities and development of anti-corruption infrastructure, and first of all the strengthening independence of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, unfortunately wasn't reflected in the state anti-corruption program. And this is actually a problem because it demonstrates the lack of readiness to take responsibilities, because we see that priorities on the work of the prosecutor's office were reflected in the memorandum. I'm sorry, can I ask you for a clarification? Do I understand correctly that it was done for leaving a room for extra political pressure on Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office? Yes, we can say it like that. Everything what we see from the previous experience of work of anti-corruption bodies says as the following: when some cases are being actively discussed in public media that undermines the work of the anti-corruption bodies. But what is the role of prosecutor's office here? I think that we will see that through the work of the prosecutor's office. ACP is one of the most unprotected bodies in the anti-corruption field, and especially in that moment of time when the case, for example, on Rotterdam Plus was filed to the court. This is 40 billion hryvnias from all pockets, of all people sitting here. It is now referred to the court, and we already see this movement with this motion and the case on Ukernafta regarding the business of Mr. Kolomoisky. And Mr. Kolomoisky is not very comfortable about that. These are actually the cases which demonstrate the will to push on specialized anti-corruption prosecution office, and unfortunately covering these holes is not covered by the state anti-corruption program, and we as a country and as a government, as a public authority, we have decided to close this gap and to do that till the end of the year. So what we actually have to do, and why the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office is one of the most unprotected bodies from among all the anti-corruption bodies. If we will resign the head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, then we will face a problem with respective appointments. And now it is possible to do through the Qualification Prosecutor's Office Commission. And I will remind you that in the nearest past, they have provided reprimands regarding the prosecutors who were reprimanded, and they were excluded from the cases which were important. And the Commission of Prosecutor's Office can do that once again. And in such a case, we can see that in such a case, the head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office could be also dismissed from his position. But how then we can assign the head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office for the National Agency on Corruption Prevention? There is a competition with the involvement of the international experts. For the SACP, the head should be appointed by the Commission, which is formed by the Parliament, actually. And how it was already implemented, we've seen that for the last 2 years, and in many aspects it was even not very pleasant. We've heard how Ursula von der Leyen last year, having her speech in the European Parliament, had to name this problem with the appointment of the head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. I said it was a shame for us that such a high official should state such issues at such high level. So first of all, we have to establish the procedure for the dismissal of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and to make it politically independent, and an independent commission should be responsible for that. And the independent commission should give the assessment of the work of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and the appointment should be provided through the independent commission with the involvement of international partners, as it is being done by with NABU and National Agency on Corruption Prevention. This is crucially important, and we all do understand that. So we won't fall from the chair, which has only 3 legs, because the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office is the 4th leg of a chair. So this body should be responsible for providing signals to the business, to private business, to other countries, that it is possible to invest to this country and to the projects in this country. Thank you very much, Irina Shiba. We will return to the political control again, but now I have a question to Irina Shiba. What is lacking for you in the state anti-corruption program, and what can improve indicators of consideration of such cases? Thank you for your question. Anastasia has already started answering in regarding the issue of the independence of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. But today also Mr. Kornienko has mentioned this issue too on recovery of anti-corruption infrastructure. And here we are talking about the declaring income and functions on checking the declared incomes. So the functions in general are already in place. From the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, the filing of declaration was terminated, and unfortunately we don't see resuming these activities. This tool is very important in order to prevent corruption and to identify cases of illegal enrichment and for the investigations conducted by NABU and for the whole infrastructure in general. And also the registers, another thing which is very important. Many registers are still closed and are not available, and it makes impossible to access the information and to conduct civil control. If you're talking about the institutions which are present here, I'm very happy that today we have permanent managers and heads of these institutions. For a long time, in the different institutions, we saw no heads, no higher officials, and state anti-corruption program offers us tools which will help us to tackle them. And in the nearest time, we will see a competition on the NABU head, and we will see how it will go. If such situations like this time occur when we don't have a head of the institution for a long time, it influences their perceptions by the society. Marken has already mentioned as regarding to the higher anti-corruption court that from the very beginning it had hadn't enough cases and it has demonstrated a huge load for the staffing which was prescribed from the very beginning. But now we see that there are much more cases, and it is necessary to increase number of judges in the court. It is unfortunately hasn't been foreseen by the state anti-corruption program, but we hope that when in the nearest future we are going to work on the relaunching number of institutions in judicial sphere, we will also face the question, and it will be actually raised, that the number of judges should be reconsidered. There are many thoughts about the higher judiciary council, and we won't touch them now, but I will now have a question to the representatives of NABU and Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office regarding the political influence and civic legitimacy. So after the higher anti-corruption court and NABU have received a judgment on Mr. Omelan's case, they mentioned that there is a political pressure on the management of NABU and State Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. So in media and social networks, you were strongly criticized. Do these things influence the reputation of your institutions, and do you recognize lack of quality in investigation, or how should you communicate in such situations? Who'd like to start? I would start. Only those who do nothing are not criticized, in fact. So the cases which are being investigated by NABU, they are all being, in fact, criticized, because usually there is always somebody who is not satisfied, the person who was accused or anyone else. So these are usually people accused in corruption. They usually have political, material resources, and they have an opportunity to influence the public thought and to create an information bubble or information agenda regarding their case. I would like to stress here that we are talking about the case where there was a positive judgment decision of two courts. This is not something related to the investigation or opening the proceedings. This is, I'm talking about the final judgment. Yes, we have positive judgments regarding the Amelance case, and we recognize that the facts which were established by the court, they are reflecting real facts, and we have to understand that the standards to criminal proceedings, they evolve, and sometimes some things which are admissible at the stage of investigation and pre-court stage, at the later stage when they're being considered in the court or reviewed in appeal instance, the standards are usually change, and the practice of proves it changes. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Semen, how should we communicate that properly in order to keep the societal trust? So, positive judgments only mean that the court system works well. But we only have to work on revealing systemic criminal schemes, to work with the staff, to communicate with the specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office, and to work on improving professional qualities of our detectives and experts. Of course, mistakes, this is something we cannot avoid in any system, but we have to do everything possible to move forward and to make conclusions of them. I will continue. We are very short of time. I have a question to Anastasia. This is a question which was already touched by Irina Shiba regarding the resuming of declaring income. I remember that National Agency on Corruption Prevention called the officials to file declarations, but I think 28 MPs have filed declarations from somebody from the office of the president. 1 or 2 persons have filed them, so not too many people. What do you think about this? What do your colleagues think about that? Should we resume it? Declaring income and opening the registers?
Перше, електронне декларування.
First, e-declaration is definitely needs to be restored. I think that this question has already been high time to be implemented, but honestly, I don't like the campaign of voluntary declaration, and I'm not ashamed to say that I'm one of the persons who did not provide the declaration because of one simple reason. Because the declaration without the response when the authorities of the national agency is restored about the check of the declarations creates conditions for impunity, because we can be in the situation that at the moment of the check or at the moment of the initiating of the question to take into liability, we'll have the new terms of acting of the verdict. We have only 3 years of the term for liability in these cases, in the wrongful information about the taking into liability and about the wrongful information in the declaration. We faced the situation that those issues could be solved just before the first instance, or we didn't have enough time for the appeal. This is the issue which we need to solve, approving in the special law, which will not only bring back the obligation to declare, but also to check these declarations. We are now in the situation when it responds the notifications of the journalists, so it's very selective. NABU and SAP can provide some of the checks, but no one checks all of them to find out 10 or 20 or 30 declarations which need to be under the attention of the law enforcement. And this is the key function which provides the so-called judicial or legal follow-up, the responsibility for the declaration. This function is very important not to be forgotten and to be restored as quick as possible, because only then we can fully control the property of the state officials. Thank you. We are already a bit late as for our schedule. So, Markian, could you please have one moment of your speech? What do you think about e-declaration? The IMF obliged us to restore e-declaration till July. What do you think about the perspective of the restoration of e-declaration and opening of the registers? A quick answer. Recently, the e-declaration was abolished where? In Russia, of course. Yes, by the way, in Russia it was abolished. So this is a very bright example. You are right. So I thank the participants of these discussions: Semen Krivonos, Andrei Senyuk, Markian Halabala, Anastasia Radina, and Irina Shiba were at this panel discussion and talked to me. Now we have the opportunity for the Q&A session. So please, these questions should be short, because we are short of time. And I do emphasize that the journalists will be able to pose their questions later. The media will meet a bit later, right? Do I understand it right? So we are posing questions now, including the media. Okay. Please raise your hands if you'd like to pose a question to the participants of the discussion. No, we'll have communication with the media about a bit later, after the discussion, after the final panel. Okay, please. Your question, please. I have a question to the head of SAP. In fact, and now about the increase of the staff of the detectives. It will lead to the increase of the staff of SAP, right? Do you work comprehensively on the issue how do we increase the staff of detectives and prosecutors? Or still the prosecutors would be more than enough? Do you solve this issue at your level? Do you plan anything to provide the proper conditions for the prosecutors? Because as far as I know, every seventh prosecutor is at war now. So you are very overloaded with work. So how do you solve this issue? Thank you. Yes, really, this problem exists. And after the full-scale invasion started, a big number of SAP prosecutors were mobilized and are protecting our country in the armed forces of Ukraine. That is why we have the increase of the workload of the prosecutors who are now working in the anti-corruption prosecution office. We've raised this question for the prosecutor general last year, and after that the staff of SAP was increased for 8 prosecutors. And because of that, last year we had selection of additional prosecutors for the vacancies. In case of the substantial increase of the number of detectives in NABU, we'll have to increase the number of prosecutors in SAP. And this issue is also in the law draft which we have just mentioned. In case if it's adopted, or at least some of the norms or provisions are adopted, this issue will be solved as well. Thank you. Please, any other questions? Yaroslav, the question is yours. We will face a huge problem that the increase of any number of any authority staff will be critically debated during the wartime and martial law, considering that we have deficit of the budget which is covered by international partners. Will it be the element which will give us an opportunity to communicate? But as a follow-up question, I have the question to Markian as the representative of the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court. As of now, we have huge issues with the the timely consideration of cases. The number of the cases is still increasing. We can instantly offer, let us increase the number of judges. But coming back to what I mentioned before, in the beginning, there was the question, do we have any alternative ways how we can, still having this speed of consideration without losing any quality, we can provide the proceedings as quick as possible if those cases are very sensitive, because we need to communicate the outcomes to get even preliminary decisions. We need some meetings, and more than one, in fact, of the collegiate of the judges. Thank you for the question, Yaroslav. Undoubtedly, the advantage of the case, if we increase the number of judges, with all due respect to you and to the authority which you represent, we don't need the decision of the parliament. To increase the number of the judges, this should be the decision of the state court administration, and this is then an advantage, that we will not face the decision of the political level. We'll just increase the funding. Of course, it will impact and it will influence, but it will be a different discussion at the level of the adoption of the law on budget. This is the advantage, but we have the alternative, which faces the legislative amendments. That is the introduction of the amendments to the Criminal Procedural Code, which would either make impossible or minimize the sabotage from the corrupt employees of, or the lawyers. This is the reform of the possible lawyers' self-governing process, because in lots of cases they are not working, even if we have the well-substantiated complaints against the lawyers from the judges. And it's very important also to hear for our audience, that is the abuse of the rights by the lawyers and the use of the option of the healthcare systems to delay the consideration of the cases. Very often it happens that we have to delay or postpone the case because of the fake sick leaves, because of the fake certificates from the hospital, from the suspects. So the control system over those healthcare institutions is not efficient, and this problem should be solved as well. And, of course, there should be the one-person consideration, the amendment to the Criminal Procedural Code as well. We have 1 minute left, but you need a microphone, unfortunately. The question is not heard because the microphone is not used. So, as for the one-person consideration, which cases can be considered? I guess that we shouldn't hope for full consensus within our court, because there can be different people with different courts would take different positions, but the majority is really would like to have the one-person consideration. So, of course, if we look at the threshold of sanctions of the criminal code of 10 years, only 1/3 of the cases will be considered by one person. If we have this threshold to 12 years, this threshold will increase to 50 or 75%, something like that. We need to finalize this panel, and we do apologize. This discussion panel is over. I thank dear participants, speakers of this panel, Semen Krivonos, Andriy Sinyuk, Markian Halabala, Anastasia Radina, and Irina Shiba were its participants. Thank you so much. And while we are waiting for our next following speakers, I will tell you a bit about the following. The following discussion will have the name Implementation of the State Anti-Corruption Program. Following steps. I invite to the stage Ellen Pak Christensen, Olga, who is the head of Anti-Corruption Initiative of the EU, EUACI, Olga Pishanska, the head of Anti-Monopoly Committee, Yaroslav Yurchishin, first deputy of the head of the Committee of Parliament of Ukraine on Anti-Corruption Policy, Katerina Budko, the head of the Council at National Agency on Corruption, Prevention, and Alexander Novikov, the head of the agency. Thank you that you joined such an important discussion. I will just tell again about some of the facts which you already know, but I will start with that. because it's a very well-known fact. I will remind you that simultaneously with the status of the candidate to the EU, Brussels has introduced some of the requirements, 7 requirements about the reforms. 7 points were there. The first 3 points are the reform of the Constitutional Court, the continuation of the justice reform, and anti-corruption. So it is so important for our European perspective. I will ask the first question to Ellen Pack Christensen, the head of EUACI, EU Anti-Corruption Initiative, who, in partnership with whom the agency created the State Anti-Corruption Program. Alan, we were speaking here about a certain skeptical attitude of the journalists and lots of other people who saw other anti-corruption programs which were not working before. Our authorities for decades of years knew how to imitate reforms. So what gives you optimism to believe that this very program will be working and that this program will be efficient to overcome corruption?
Thank you very much for that question, and it's great to be here. Happy to answer your question. Let me just start by thanking our NACP colleagues and Alexander for the great work in preparing the state program. I know a lot of work went into that. Very impressive. And I would also like to say now, when we had the anti-corruption institutions in the previous panel, that for us working closely with them in our daily work, it has been so impressive to see how they have continued their work since Russia's invasion last year, how you have adapted to a new context, very difficult conditions, but you continued, and some of the institutions even processed more cases last year than the year before. I think that's quite an achievement. I believe the high level attendance today, and now I'll also come to your question, the high level attendance and the good discussions we have had here show the importance of this program and what is at stake here for Ukraine. It shows that even at these very difficult times of war, you have a government that actually is strongly committed to move ahead and to lift this anti-corruption agenda forward. And of course, with the upcoming recovery efforts and with the EU integration path, I mean, I think the fight against corruption in Ukraine is more important now than ever. And we saw with the national survey that was presented today that still a lot of work to be done there, because there's still many challenges in a number of sectors. And I can assure you that your international friends and EU partners will keep a very close eyes to what is going to happen here. The most important issue, of course, is the implementation of the program, and you're right, so many programs, roadmaps, action plans were adopted by Ukraine, by the government, that were never really fully implemented. And this time it must be different, and I believe it will be different. And I would like to mention this political commitment that we also feel in the room today. The commitment by the line ministers that are actually in charge of implementing quite a lot of the content of the program. I would like to mention the inclusive process behind the program, meaning that you had a number of officials from the ministries, from the agencies, from other institutions, I mean, that created an ownership to this program. And that ownership, I think, in itself is extremely important. And then you have what was also mentioned by Andriy Wisniewski when he presented the program. There is this component of monitoring. So we will be able to follow very closely what is going to be delivered and what is not. We can keep ministers, officials to account. It will be transparent. If something is not going to the way it should, I'm sure that someone will do something about it. We know that civil society organizations, international partners, very closely will follow how this program is implemented. So I think that we should be optimistic, and I also think that we are in a different position today than we were just I would say a few months ago, that the Russia's invasion has created another less tolerance for corruption. I think the survey also mentioned that today, and that has an impact also at the political level, and that I think is what we are seeing now.
Дякую, дякую.
Thank you. That was not the last question to Alan, but still the following question will be to Olga Pishanska, the head of Anti-Monopoly Committee. How does your institution, is your constitution going to implement the program? Why is it important to you, and how will you use it? Good day. I thank you for the question and for the opportunity to have a speech at this forum, and I thank you for the being insistent and your consistent work of the agency. I'd like to mention that Anti-Monopoly Committee during all of this period of time has been cooperating with the agency. We had really constructive discussions which led to a specific plan of actions, which has a separate part in the document which is approved now. And during a certain period of time, with a certain time frame, the Anti-Monopoly Committee should provide a plan, should develop the law drafts with the suggestions and offers on the improvement of the work of the Anti-Monopoly Committee. Besides that, the Anti-Monopoly Committee has already developed the draft of the offers to the reform draft, and some of the provisions are included into the state anti-corruption program as well. There is a certain list there. For instance, the increase of the institutional work of the committee, in particular the protection of the employees and workers, the improvement of remuneration process. It includes the very specific time frame for the consideration of cases, because as you know, the committee didn't have the proper time period and time frame. We have the liability period in case of any of the abuse, but since the beginning of the opening of the case, it can be done forever. And also the program includes the obligation to provide any of the suggestions to have a very precise time frame for the considering of the case. We need to improve the process of the checks of the economic entities. This tool exists in the committee, but still we need to develop a very specific and understandable process how it will be implemented. The same concerns the improvement of the format of firing and hiring of the authorized persons, for it to be compliant with all of the legislation and constitution of Ukraine, and for it to coincide with the selection and firing of the head of Anti-Monopoly Committee. And we have more. In each of the sectors of the work of Anti-Monopoly Committee, we have developed some of the offers and suggestions to decrease corruption risks and to improve the efficiency of the work of the committee.
Clear, thank you very much. I have a question to Yaroslav Yurchyshin, First Deputy of the head of the Parliament Committee on Anti-Corruption Policy. So, for me, program looks like a long carriage, which included a lot of work, and some wheels are functioning well, but others are not functioning properly. In this discussion, I'd like to ask you the question regarding the story with the Constitutional Court of Ukraine about the Commission selecting candidates for the judges of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. Still, we see that this issue is paused, but for us, this is a requirement number one regarding the Constitutional Court. I would like to remind you that the Constitutional Court can cancel any reform and any beginning or any initiative which we are talking about with you today. So, many institutions may have problems, and they may be thought like this not properly functioning will. So will the program facilitate that? Let's be realistic. That's actually why we adopted the anti-corruption program, not at the level of the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine, but at the level of the parliament, because when we've been construed the strategy, we already thought that it should be adopted by the parliament of Ukraine, and then since the overall structure would be very capital, we would be able to keep the motion of the whole process. So to switch from the totalitarian society to a democratic one, we had to envisage respective provisions which will let us use the support, the whole scale of support which could be provided by the EU. And in order to develop our political memory, we are clearly in mind that to start this initiative, we had to start from the position that we have already started the discussion on future membership of Ukraine in the EU. So now, of course, we can talk about the heroism of the parliament and the cabinet of ministers, but since due to the program we see that there are some limitations in independence of respective authorities, and since we have commitments towards the IMF, let's still be realistic that the requirements which are put on us are very difficult, and it will be very difficult to implement them. Today's forum is called because we have received a lot of commitment. We have to get from the officials of different organizations their commitment to fulfill the program. This is important, and they have to speak publicly about their intention and to take public commitment, take personal decision to support the anti-corruption program. We will definitely see them hindering the process, quietly hindering, but we will not support that, and we will fight that. But in any case, now thanks to today's event, we saw that this 5-year anti-corruption program, and we have been changing the years of this program, and this is such an important, interesting thing. So actually, what is the thing I am trying to bring it here? Will this program stay on paper only or not, as in Yanukovych times? But I think that this is not the time it will. And it is because of the objective factors. In wartime period, the corruption is not perceived in society. And without the implementation of this anti-corruption program, at least 80%, we won't have the negotiations on the membership in the EU this year. And if we won't reach that this year, and we remember that year 2024 is the year of elections, it will set us back to 4 or 5 years. So now with the involvement of many actors, we have developed a very ambitious but still very realistic to implement program. And at this meeting today, we received a lot of answers on who is going to implement this program. And now we are expecting the attention of the journalists and civil society to attentively follow their promises. And now thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask Alexander Novikov. I know that actually as to the perception and non-perception and regarding different wheels, I like this metaphor of the wheels of the carriage. I know that the state anti-corruption program was developed in a difficult manner because many agencies believe that it will be another bureaucratic paper, and I know that the Council of Judges sent a letter on 35 pages describing the problems and issues regarding this problem. How are you going to work, and how do you actually see the cooperation in the system with resistance? Because we understand that the resistance is there, it will never disappear. Yes, resistance will be there, but today we've heard the answer. How can we overcome it? We have to involve all the counterparts to this discussion. So the head of the parliament, vice prime minister, the head of the anti-corruption committee, the head of anti-monopoly committee, they all have participated in the public presentation of the program, and they committed themselves to implement it. We believe that the dialogue, inclusivity will be followed, and we believe that even with opponents we will be able to reach a consensus. And even at the later stage of the development of this program, even the Council of Judges supported it. We remember the work of Mr. Robinson, Why Nations Fall, and we remember that only the nations which communicate, which have a dialogue with the society regarding the most important issues which are worrying the society and the power, and we remember that the corruption is one of the most important issues there. We believe in the dialogue. Thank you. Katerina Budko is a head of the Civil Council under the National Agency of Corruption Prevention. What do you think? Can we as a civil society influence the implementation of the anti-corruption program? I have started this panel from the point that breakthroughs are made through tragedies and even through such situations like we had in 2014 on Maidan. Is the war an accelerator of reforms? So thank you very much for your question. I'd like to start from the following. When I was looking at the agenda of today's meeting, I have pointed an attention to the issue that I am the only representative of the civil society sector, and this is a huge responsibility for me, but still a lot of colleagues are here in this hall. Is the war an accelerator? Yes, it is, because war and the situations like we have it today, as it was mentioned correctly by Yaroslav, brings us to understanding that we are lacking time for further discussions, for further hindering of processes. We spent a lot of time on developing and agreeing the anti-corruption program and strategy. There were a lot of public authorities which were not agree with many provisions of the draft documents, and now we don't have actually many time to implement this strategy. We have only half a year to implement the majority of the amendments which have been outlined in the program. And we understand, and I think each of you sitting in this hall, you do understand that comparing to the stage of the development of the strategy before it was adopted, we will have to apply even more efforts to implement it, but in a much shorter time. I'm sure that there will be still authorities which will not wish to implement the provisions of the strategy and the program, but we are again facing the situation when we are lacking of time to implement most of provisions we have provided. I have a question to Mr. Alan Pach Christensen. From many not representatives of politics, but from the activists, anti-corruption activists, we hear that our civil servants and civil officials, they are very clever, and when foreign experts come to our country, they don't really understand how civil servants and officials are trying to preserve the schemes and all the influence they have. Should we treat them in some way different comparing to Western politics and officials or not?
Thanks. I think you might find examples where you have international experts coming to Ukraine without really understanding the context and how officials are working and how the corruption schemes are working in the country. I think for a program like the one I represent, I mean, the combination of having very good, insightful Ukrainians working in this field as staff of the program, combined with the internationals that have the international expertise, that is also important for Ukraine. I think that somehow can do so that we can mitigate the risk of having experts coming here that don't have the proper understanding of the context. So I'm not so afraid about that, actually. We did, as a program, participate actively in formulating the strategy and the state anti-corruption program together with NSCP. We also draw on best international practice and very good experts, Ukrainian and internationals. And I think it's a good example of how that can work.
Дякую вам. До Ярослава.
Thank you very much for your answer. I have a question to Yaroslav Roshishin. What can you tell us about the statements of some politics when they say that when some commissions select the officials to respective institutions, they say that foreigners cannot have majority in the commissions because this is a threat for the sovereignty and subjectivity of Ukraine. How do you treat these claims and statements? If we transfer this into a simple language, nobody. So it's actually it is absolutely incorrect. In all recommendations, in all legislation which we have elaborated on, the final decision is on the Ukrainian subject. Of course, we still have some problems, but the competitions involving an external and foreign expertise, and I would like to remind you that we have experimented with the Civil Council of Integrity in judicial system, and civil society expertise demonstrated not even this, almost the same level of expertise comparing to the foreign ones. So what we saw from this experience, the representatives of the civil society, they would bring more benefits to the processes as well, comparing to and as a foreign experts. And we also had cases when civil society tried to somehow change their approach. And in any case, we do not treat foreign experts as a threat for our sovereignty. This is an effective mechanism of limitation of corruption. So this pattern, which we have applied previously, we will use it in the near future. But I would like to refer to the previous question. Is there any pattern for the corruption prevention in Europe, because the corruption, it doesn't exist because the corruption deteriorates the state and it changes all the time. So we are all seeking for the best working model, and it is very good that in many aspects Ukraine, and at the level of Greco, Mr. Alexander can already say about that, is becoming an example as a best practice which is offered and demonstrated to other countries. And the aspects which are covered by our state anti-corruption strategy, and they are digitalization, competitive approaches, and involvement of the expert society, consensus nature, or compromises in certain aspects are becoming the practices and the practices which the world is already taking from us. Even well-developed countries are taking that from us because we are now dealing with the problems of a higher level which we've never faced before and which our colleagues have never faced before in the past. And coming back to the not very, so to say, sexy topic, why the strategy is important? Because we demonstrate to the world, asking them to provide us huge resources for the recovery, how we are going to work further and how we are going to guarantee overcoming the problems which we faced previously and our foreign partners face now. So I now would like to express my gratitude not only to the National Agency on Corruption Prevention, but to all those involved into this, who were involved into this work, and to the European Union Anti-Corruption Initiative for their efforts. Yes, of course, this case is not such huge comparing to other cases, for example, with NABU, but thank you all involved for your active work, and you helped a lot to make this strategy happen. Thank you very much, Yaroslav, for your final words. We have 3-4 minutes till the end of our meeting. I would kindly ask you to give just a few final words. Maybe you would like to add something at the end of the meeting. Olga, let's start from you. Thank you. I will try to be as brief as possible. The corruption is not only a bribery or a minor offense. This is something what influences the society, public authorities, and combating corruption is a comprehensive work. It should cover all the directions which exist in public domain and establishment of the programs which would establish new approaches and new assessment of this problem in the society are very relevant for today. I believe that this program have this approach, and I'm happy that the Anti-Monopoly Committee was involved into this work on developing this program. And relaunching the Anti-Monopoly Committee will increase the trust to this institution, and it will increase the investment attractiveness and also improve market conditions. Thank you very much.
Christensen.
Please, Alan Pack Christensen.
Yeah, let me just say a few words about how we from our side will support the implementation of the program. We have talked about this monitoring coordination tool that will be developed, and our program will deliver what is called an information system to that extent, and I think that will be a very important part of the NACP monitoring of what is going to happen there. We will provide expertise in corruption risk assessment. We will provide studies and surveys, and we will assist NACP in working on bylaws and regulations. I think a concrete example of what we're going to do is to work in the field of education. Now we heard the Minister of Education today talking about the need to work with the youth and in the schools, raise awareness, and together with NSP we are going to develop what we can call an anti-corruption curriculum that will be integrated in all levels of the educational system. I think one important point to make is that, I mean, our program will not be able to fund the implementation as such. And there is actually still an outstanding funding issue because the program will not be implemented without the funds being available. I think Andri mentioned in his presentation that there will need to be developed 61 IT products, IT tools. Very important that the sources for that budget will be identified. I think with this program, when implemented, I think it really has the potential to create a new momentum in the fight against corruption. And I wish NSP and the line ministries and the agencies a lot of success in this work, because it is going to be very hard work for you in the coming months. So wish you luck.
Thank you, thank you. So please, Katarina Budkor, the head of the council at the NPC. Yes, as I already mentioned, we have lots of work ahead of us, and in fact the presentation today and this program adoption is not the first step, it's the first semi-step on the way which we need to overcome to implement the changes. And we don't need just to write down the increase of the detective staff. We have lots of work to increase this staff really, and to improve the role of the society in the judicial reform. This is just the beginning of the first step, and I'd like to appeal to all of the actors who are interested in the implementation, the civil society and the NAPC, who are really are the fans of this program, to spend as much efforts as possible for it to be really implemented, because this is the further way for us to Europe in the future of the European Union. Alexander Novikov, please. Thank you, dear colleagues, for the participation in this event. We are totally sure that without having an objective, without having the end point, the destination point, the amount of efforts will never matter as well, because we'll have different directions. So in the end of the day, we need to answer the question, why do we need the way to the future without corruption? And what's our destination point? We need to achieve the integral part of the society. For each of us, it means the best conditions for business and implementation of talents for each citizens of Ukraine, the best conditions for the implementation by every person in Ukraine. And this is the answer how to bring back 7 million of Ukrainians who are now in Europe after our victory. It's not just an anti-corruption program. This is the program how to make Ukraine a very prosperous and rich country where every single person will be able to implement whatever he or she would like to. Why we are not this kind of state? Because we are now in the infant age, not even teenage, but infant age. Why can't we solve that with separate laws, the question of transformation of the country into such kind of modern state? Because the state is a complicated system. That is why the law on SAP or Anti-Monopoly Committee cannot solve this issue on their own, separately. So why don't we have this systematic way of Ukraine towards the efficient state? Because integrity is the cultural component and efficiency component, because the government for 3 years does not have the agenda adopted by the parliament. And as of today, the state anti-corruption program is the only for the whole country systematic document which gives the answer how to make the country efficient. Unfortunately, it's the only document like this. We hope that the state anti-corruption program will push all the political players in this country to think in a systematic way, because just some separate episodic laws will never solve the issue of efficiency of the state. Looking at the example of the Anti-Monopoly Committee, I'd like to tell why systematic approach is important. Because in the state program, we registered and documented that the institutional capacity can be achieved with equal rules for everyone. And one of the 7 points of the EU, which were announced by Ursula von der Leyen, is the implementation of the anti-oligarch law. We need to say how it is really. For 30 years, oligarchs, different financial industrial groups, grasped and covered the state, the parliament, the government, for it not to be taken by anybody else. So only together with the civil society, only together with all of the citizens of Ukraine and our international partners, we can provide the institutional strength and capacity of the state authorities. And this is the foundation of the anti-corruption program. Only then we will get the efficient state. What will the efficiency of the state influence? If we have the efficient state, we will be compliant with the criteria of the EU membership and NATO membership and OECD membership as well. And we are moving along this way. 2 weeks ago, I've been in the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. Greco just took us out of the list of the blacklist of the countries which do not take these measures. So in the end of the day, I'd like to say what's our direction of movement. We are going to the future without corruption, to the integrity in the state and just society. And only if the authorities give the answer to this question, they will stay at power. 2 latest electoral campaigns after the Revolution of Dignity showed that only the authorities which promise to solve the issue of integrity and justice will win at the elections. So I believe that both the President and the Parliament, not the agency, in fact, not NAPC, have to and aim to satisfy the societal request to create the just state. Thank you. Thank you for the participation in the discussion. I thank everyone who paid these efforts and working on the state anti-corruption program. I wish all of you and all of us strength, responsibility and courage for this program to be implemented. I thank the audience, I thank our viewers who were watching us online, and I do invite all of the media to get to the place where you'll have an opportunity to ask the questions to the panelists. If they have the opportunity, they will answer the journalists' questions. Thank you, and I hope that everything will be okay and successful with the anti-corruption reform and with the state anti-corruption program. Thank you.